So good afternoon from Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Perbrick and I'll moderate the discussion today. With us also we have Roddy Gow, who is chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, calling in from the east coast of the USA today, and we'll see Roddy shortly. And our focus today is decoupling, and we're asking the question, is this a crisis of interdependence, or is it the end of globalisation? And obviously, we're largely talking about the situation between China and the USA, but decoupling between those two countries, if it is really happening, obviously impacts the rest of the world as well. So perhaps we can just, as an introduction, but very quickly skip back to how we've come to this point without going into too much detail, because I think it's a very long historical set of circumstances. But in recent history, in 2018, President Trump, which seems a lifetime ago perhaps, imposed tariffs on some goods imported from China. Later that year, the Chinese government imposed duties of 178% on sorghum imports from the USA. And from there, I think what we're calling a trade war escalated, and relations between the two countries obviously have been pretty difficult as well. So we could say there's been effective decoupling from the People's Republic of China, obviously because of the dynamic zero COVID policy that has interrupted supply chains for the past 3 years. Seems a very long time, which is a massive change to all of us, because China accounts for 28% of all global manufacturing output, or it did in 2019 before the pandemic interrupted the flows of trade. And most recently, last week in the 20th Party Congress in Beijing, President Xi Jinping stated in his opening speech, and I quote, we have adhered to the supremacy of the people and the supremacy of life, adhered to dynamic zero COVID, and achieved major positive results in the overall prevention and control of the epidemic and economic and social development, unquote. So from this, I think many analysts are thinking that there isn't likely to be a near-term change in dynamic zero COVID, and that effectively keeps China cut off from many trade and economic links, which it previously had before 2019 with the rest of the world. So we do face a prospect of what some analysts have called possibly de-globalization, and that's one of the questions we'll ask today. And I think we have three quite different perspectives, but people with deep insight into China, its trade relations, and what has happened and what may happen. First, we have Jacob Gunter, who's a senior analyst at the Mercator Institute for Chinese Studies, known as MERICS, prior to which Jacob served with the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. Of particular interest, Jacob has written most of the major report from the European Chamber, which is titled Decoupling, Severed Ties and Patchwork Globalization, which if you haven't read it, I would suggest you do, released by the European Chamber in China in partnership with MERICS, which gives great insight into what's been happening for European businesses in China. Jacob is, I believe, based in Germany at the moment, but he's studied and worked in Beijing, Nanjing, Shanghai, and Yuyao. So Jacob, we really appreciate your insight today. So next we have Charles Mock. I think I grew up looking at Charles Mock's career, I think, in Hong Kong, Charles, and a very successful career. Charles is currently a visiting scholar at the Global Digital Policy Incubator of the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University. He notably served as an elected, I stress that word, member of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong from 2012 to 2020, representing the information technology sector. And I think most notably, certainly for me, living in Hong Kong at that time in the early 90s, Charles founded Hong Kong Net, which was later sold to NTT Communications, one of the first IP telecoms operators in Hong Kong. So Charles has really been at the forefront of the growth of internet technology and connectivity in China. And last but not least, Dr. Lei Chengyi, the director of the Taiwan Studies Program at the University of Nottingham, and a very accomplished academic, if I may say, prior to which she had roles at the University of Duisburg, Germany, and Leiden University in the Netherlands. She was a research fellow at the Economic and Social Research Council from 2011 to 13, and a postdoctorate researcher at the Institute of East Asia Studies in Germany from 2010 to 2011. And her book, which you may like to pick up, is Taiwanese Business or Chinese Security Asset, which was published by Routledge in 2011. So just for housekeeping, a very quick reminder to everyone, we're on the Zoom webinar platform today, so your videos and microphones can't be displayed and only the panelists can be heard. We do want to hear from you, so please could you put questions up in Zoom chat if you'd like to, and we'll come to those questions after the opening remarks by each of the panelists. So we will have time for that, I think, don't worry. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes. So Jacob, perhaps you could kick us off, because you're back in Europe. You spent a great deal of time in many parts of China, so you have insight into the situation from both perspectives, I think. Could you give us an overview of how you think China's current direction, especially relating to dynamic zero COVID and other economic policies, are affecting economic investment in China, and how European companies or other international companies see those policies, and what do you think is going to happen in the near future, especially in relation to this question of decoupling?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So yes, as to the kind of zero COVID policy and its impact on European and foreign companies, and more broadly looking at what Xi Jinping's third term will mean as far as these trends towards decoupling goes. First off, I would start off by suggesting that decoupling in the broad sense should not be measured by whether companies are leaving China or not, and whether they're divesting out of China or not, because even in the midst of the trade war and the tech war and the zero COVID policy that's been dragging on, and I suspect will continue to drag on for some time, we're not seeing divestment. What we're instead seeing is a very strong shift in corporate strategy. So decoupling is less about leaving China. It's more about preparing your operations in China to be able to be decoupled from your global operations. Making sure that your technology and your supply chains and your personnel and your R&D are onshored and localized and ready to kind of comply with the strategic vision that Xi Jinping has set out, rather than being ready to kind of be cut off to certain degrees from your global operations and from the rest of the world. So with that in mind, looking at the Party Congress and looking at what Xi Jinping has said, I think it's very clear that we have a message of continuity on the economic front, and that includes on the zero COVID policy. Now, continuity should not be mistaken as just kind of continuing to muddle along. This is continuity of an incredibly ambitious, approach to the political economy in the country, and a profound change in the relationship between the party and the state and corporates, whether those are local or foreign, whether those are state-owned or private. So I'll kind of touch upon these three main areas that I see as troublemaking and driving forward this decoupling trend of needing to localize and decouple China operations from global operations. So starting with the zero COVID policy, Xi Jinping's clean sweep of the Politburo tells me that his priorities and his ideology reign supreme. The complete absence of anyone from the Chinese Communist Youth League, the fact that they clearly just knocked off one of the Politburo spots to make sure Hu Chuanhua didn't have a place, not even in the standing committee, but not even in the Politburo itself. Xi reigned supreme. And that means that zero COVID is going to continue at least for some time in my assessment, because from the moment that it became clear that China's zero COVID policy was working in the first kind of towards the middle of 2020, and that they had contained the virus and were sort of keeping it out with closed borders, and that at the same time, the rest of the world looked like absolute chaos, Xi Jinping very, very carefully made this into his own policy. And the messaging has been very clear that the CCP and Xi Jinping as its core are different from other governments and from other political leadership in that they protect human life. This is the message that we keep hearing. They protect the lives of their people. And so it would be incredibly difficult for Xi Jinping to move away from this, because it is his name that is attached to it. It is his party and his role at the core of the party that is part of that. The thing is that this is driving this broader decoupling trend in that you have so many foreign business people that were not able to get back into China starting in early 2020. I only barely got back in myself. I was in one of the first flights into Beijing that had to go into centralized quarantine in mid-March of 2020. But so many people got stuck outside of the country and weren't able to get back. And what this did was it caused companies to start localizing their staff even more. So you can't get your foreign chief representative in, fine, you find a Chinese national to be your chief representative. You can't get some of your foreign engineers in to work on some new assembly line, then you make sure that you find Chinese personnel on your team are going to learn some of those skills so they can do it themselves. And again, what this does is this creates a decoupled sort of China operation that has fewer and fewer direct ties with their global headquarters. And that lack of people-to-people ties is causing all sorts of issues that maybe we can go into in the Q&A. The second kind of big point for how Xi Jinping's agenda is going to affect and promote this decoupling is on the technology front. There was such a clear message in Xi Jinping's report at the Party Congress about the need to promote technological self-reliance, to close technology gaps, and to kind of catch up, because this is, in his view, a national security risk. And so you add that need for that technological self-reliance plus the cybersecurity and data security elements of all of this. And again, we're getting this decoupling of your China operations and your global operations that I'll dig into this a bit more in detail in a second, that you have to try to find local network equipment suppliers and network service providers, depending on what kind of rule sets you fall under. And this means purging your systems of foreign, computers and hardware and software and digital solutions, and choosing local alternatives instead. And then lastly, I'll really quickly touch on the kind of bilateral and multilateral nature of decoupling. That this is not, this is primarily, I think, a China-driven story, but the US is absolutely player number two, and maybe only a close second to China at this point. But also the EU and Japan and others are in on this game as well. So from China's perspective, when we're talking about decoupling, the main realm that is happening in this technology. Yeah, there are some supply chain issues that came from the trade war, but I used to work with a bunch of these companies. The thing is that trying to have a bilateral tariff war in a globalized world economy filled with multinational companies is kind of a faulty premise. You'll always be able to find ways to move around them. So the trade war and the tariffs and stuff, that was workable. The technology war aspects are much less navigable and impose much higher costs. So on China's side, we see this securitization of everything, that you need to secure supply chain. There's supply chain security, there's technology security, there's cyber security, data security, critical information infrastructure security, all of these different things that are pushing the securitization drive, coupled with the broader self-reliance campaign. So not only do you need to have this secure and controllable technology within China, but to the best of your ability, even in your non-sensitive technologies, there's a push to localize your supply chains. And that means either choose local partners or to bring your foreign suppliers into the China market, to invest and to onshore. And the data from the European Chamber of Commerce's Business Confidence Survey is quite clear on this. There are about 5 times as many companies that are onshoring supply chains than there are offshoring supply chains. So the corporations are responding to these demands. And then on the flip side, we have the drivers from the liberal market economies, the US, Europe, Japan, et cetera. And that's being driven by this kind of impatience that China never really lived up to WTO membership, but also the geopolitical frictions and security aspects, which even Europe is now having to look at because of China's ties with Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, that were established just moments before the invasion itself. But also we're starting to see terms and discussions about economic security pop up more and more, even in Europe, which is quite indicative of the direction things are moving in. And so when we look at this, what I see is that from a corporate perspective, European companies have sort of different positions based on their technology and their position in the China market. So China's own goals it's not about closing up. It's not about trying to get rid of foreign companies and sort of go it alone. In a lot of ways, China has actually been continuously opening up to try to capture more and onshore more of that technology and to onshore those supply chains. So, there's some very different goals here that we see, like, on the negative side, protecting market share where they have local companies that are globally competitive on technology. And like 5G equipment is a really clear example of that. European and Japanese and Korean and American competitors are being squeezed out of the market because Huawei and ZTE are good enough. And it's now about protecting market share for them so they can compete more abroad. On the far opposite end of that spectrum, we have this need to onshore foreign technology where China cannot catch up soon. So the chemical sector is a good example of this, with ExxonMobil and BASF both having these $10 billion projects in Guangdong. So I won't dig into all of these for the sake of time, but there are huge risks depending on where you are, and also huge opportunities depending on where you are. And it's a very complex system to navigate at the moment. But again, those who are in China, including those like in the chemicals industry where they are onshoring aggressively, and that they're even getting favorable conditions to do so, they're still going to have to deal with the technology divergence and the localization requirements. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up there for the sake of time. But yeah, perhaps some of these topics are of greater interest to people. And as well, I would just add to all of this that we now have a growing list of actions on the US side as well, even just in the last few weeks. The CHIPS Act and the export controls on semiconductors, including on US persons being allowed to participate in China's semiconductor industry. That is as close of a declaration of technological economic warfare as what I could imagine so far, at least. And that it came right before the Party Congress will only accelerate Xi Jinping's emphasis on closing technology gaps and the urgency with which they have to achieve that. But again, even in the EU, we have this emerging toolkit coming out of all these different measures and mechanisms that they weren't imagined originally with China in mind, but they now all have China written all over them. And even in Japan, you have your Ministry of Economic Security. You have a diversification strategy, not so much to pull out of China, but to diversify future investments into Southeast Asia. And yeah, we're seeing that the major liberal market economies it's no longer enough for them to just kind of either skate by or to even just look at kind of mitigating distortions in their own markets. They're also taking an increasingly offensive approach. And that's going to just complicate this decoupling story even more, because it was already hard enough with just what China is doing. It's now become a bilateral and multilateral game as well. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to, I guess, back to Martin.
Yeah, Jacob, thank you very much. That's a really nice introduction, and you packed a lot in there as well, if I may say. I was very interested to hear one point you made about it's actually difficult to decouple, considering the nature of many of the globalized international multinational companies. Perhaps an example of that is, I think next week in Hong Kong, there's a meeting hosted by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Global Financial Leaders Forum, I think it's called, to which the CEOs of Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, and quite a few other very large international, especially US investment banks, will be attending. I think that's an interesting point about, despite the decoupling of certain areas of manufacturing services, banks still seem to have this huge appetite for aspects of business in China, despite what their governments are saying. So I'm not sure how they'll explain that to the Biden administration, but we'll see. That'll be an interesting conference. Perhaps we could cut across to the technology issues, because perhaps everything is related to technology these days that you might say so, Charles. So could we ask you to give your insight in this? How do you think decoupling is changing the global technology landscape? Is it changing it? And do you see the pressures on, for example, harmonization of global technology standards? And in that regard, especially with what you've built with an internet company in the 90s and been involved in internet policy, are we going to have two blocks of global standards in various parts of technology as part of this decoupling? Thanks.
Well, actually, I think like every answers to many of these questions, it could be yes or no. And I think following on many of the things that Jacob has been saying, I mean, it's a great introduction and into this whole very complex subject. Decoupling and globalizations, we talk about them in the same breath all the time these days, but to me, they are really not just bipolar. And I think Jacob gave a very good insight into why it is that way. And especially when I caught up on the point about the companies at this stage are actually not decoupling. They are actually decoupling their Chinese operation. They want to make sure that in the future environment, in the current developing environment, in the future, they will be able to continue to operate in the Chinese market. And I think that is a great point to take home. But of course, today, when we think about decoupling, we always talk about technology, probably because semiconductors particularly has been in the center of this whole saga of in development, and people are talking about more and more technologies areas becoming part of these affected areas like AI, like quantum computing, and so on. But I think we also have to be aware that actually this hasn't started just today. If we think back 10, 20, 30 years before, we seem to have seen the same kind of, let's say, Western government trying to decouple China in other areas, including like satellite technologies, including like aircraft technologies, and so on. And we could argue whether or not that had been successful in the past. But I think what is real is that it is becoming more clear that it is moving from what used to be a focus on dual-use technologies, military and civilian use dual-use technologies, to much broader coverage of technology, semiconductor. Where do you draw the line of the high end and the low end, and AI and so on? But I think we should take a step back and think about what is really globalization. When I look at where I came from, what I did in business in terms of the internet areas, if I look at that and I thought, hey, China has decoupled the West almost from the beginning. So many of these companies, internet technology companies, couldn't get into China to operate. And of course, we have to separate between the kinds of companies that we're talking about. China had been very welcoming to many of these technologies that are bringing in, let's say, systems, technologies, hardware, and so on, but they just don't want the platforms or the service providers to go in and operate, even including telecommunications technology providers, the network providers. And many people would also argue that China hasn't followed on many of the WTO commitment that they have signed when they entered the WTO. So what we're really talking about, decoupling and globalization, I think we really have to separate, in a sense, what we're talking about with many of these sectors that has to do with supply chain, has to do with manufacturing, versus some of the other areas that we're talking about, like services, and even platform technologies. So when we think about something that is happening to many of these areas, such as semiconductors, it is very different from when we're thinking about something about another sector like finance, which is a service sector. So that is sometimes also where I would draw the line as well, because that's where I came from. We always look at, let's say, information technologies. What is information technologies? It could be about Cisco. It could be about a hardware maker. It could be also about a company that is like Google or Facebook, which would be a platform. So the challenges that they face are actually very different. And of course, there are also many areas, and if we think about the manufacturing supply chain that are so dependent on China right now, well, we don't talk about them every day. Right now, we think about semiconductors, but in reality, there are also many areas that you simply cannot decouple from China because of the dependencies. It could be about many of these other things. It could be like more on the lower end of manufacturing, maybe garment, maybe food and other areas. So to me, we never were truly globalized in a way. There are many of these areas that we haven't been globalized before for many different reasons, particularly because in the internet area, because of China's resistance to opening up for the last 20 or 30 years. Now, Martin, you mentioned about standards, and it's a good example of where China has been trying to exert or increase its influence on where things are going, in addition to what is happening today in terms of the supply chain and so on. Now, China has actually been promoting or pushing its own technology standard for a long time. And in a way, there's nothing wrong about that. Every country probably would want to do it, would want the international global standards in terms of technologies to be able to be more suitable or conducive to its own development goals. And China has been very smart in the past to leverage on its market size when they are trying to push for international standard adoption. But of course, we could also argue that there are some key differences when China were doing it in many different areas, such as Wi-Fi standards in the past, such as 5G or 6G in future, these telecommunications, mobile standards, as well as some of the more internet infrastructure standards, such as IP addressing and so on. These areas that China has been very active in recent years to try to push for their own national standards to be adopted as the global standards. They often have a particular policy, national policies behind it that we look at when the broader technology sector look at it. We would consider it to be more tied to a technology vision that China is trying to build for domestic within China, and they're trying to expand it to the world outside, which is very much tied to surveillance and censorship. One example would be the new IP initiative pushed by Huawei, probably on behalf of the government, to try to establish a new IP addressing system that would be pretty much allow the operator or the government to be able to trace anyone that anyone sending a particular message. They would probably be accountable, and they would probably be able to be traced by the authorities. Now, finally, I would also want to say that when we think about decoupling, we probably shouldn't be just thinking about just those countries like the US or Europe or China, or even Japan and Korea and so on. We're looking at the leaders. Particularly in this case, we're probably thinking about semiconductors again. But even in the semiconductors and electronics areas, we probably should also be thinking about some of the other countries that are affected. For example, Vietnam, for example, India, for example, Thailand, and some of these other countries that are probably beneficiary of the current discussion about decoupling, because actually some of these companies are trying to move some of their operations from China to some of these other countries in order to be less dependent on China. So in that sense, are we decoupling to become more globalized? because actually some of these other smaller countries are going to be able to benefit as well. So one final point I do want to, because Jacob, what you talked about got me thinking as well about using Chinese personnel, companies using Chinese personnel to operate in China and so on. And this is very consistent with one trend that I'm seeing in China and in Hong Kong, that many of the major, let's say, technology platform companies and so on, they are actually decoupling their staff in the sense that they want to take many of their, let's say, staff that has to do with, let's say, platform moderation for social media and so on. They are actually now decoupling their staff in Hong Kong and China and say that they are not responsible for any of these decisions because of the advent of all these national security laws and so on. They want to protect their employees. So in a sense, it is not only about continuing with business and using local staff and so on. It is also to protect it is to protect their local staff, even if they are Chinese citizens, even if they are Hong Kong citizens, because they consider that if they are involved in some of these decisions, they would become liable. So in that sense, I just want to follow on that point. Is something that I have observed, particularly for some of these service types of companies. So I am imagining if this is happening for technology platforms, it probably is also happening for financial services companies as well. So I guess I'll stop here and turn the time back to Martin and Chunyi.
Thank you very much, Charles. Too many issues there, and we could ask you to unpack them, I think, for a lot longer. I think the last one was especially interesting, and how companies that are based in Hong Kong adapt to different change circumstances, perhaps, about what their employees can say openly. And as you know, coming from Hong Kong, previously, I think many international companies already adapted in the mainland. They would behave differently in the mainland than they would in Hong Kong, but in protection of employees is rather different. And
yeah, I'm actually not talking about even just protecting them. I'm actually saying that, you know, they just want to make sure that if there's a problem, that the government would say, hey, why did you do this? Why did you make this decision? And they would be able to say, my local staff in Hong Kong or China never made the decision. It was made in Singapore. It was made in somewhere else. So just to protect them from legal liability.
And I've seen that with banks, especially in the past. Investment banks have been doing that quietly for some time with that decision-making process, which is interesting. Charles, before we go on to Chunyi, perhaps I can also ask you a quick follow-up question about technology rather than doing it later, because you touched on semiconductors, and obviously Jacob mentioned the CHIPS Act in the US. So it's a critical area, especially for Chunyi from her home in Taiwan, which is one of the largest manufacturers of certain semiconductors. And I asked this question with the context of my first job after leaving Hong Kong government was actually with Intel Corporation in 1999. And at that time, I used to visit the Intel. It wasn't a fabrication plant, but it was a factory in Shanghai. But Intel did later have a fabrication plant, which is where semiconductors are fabricated, manufactured in Dalian. And I think there was another, I don't think it was a full fab, but there was another assembly plant in Chengdu. So we've had chip manufacturers in China for some time. Why can't China manufacture chips on a large scale? What is the problem, do you think?
That really is the billion dollar question. I don't have a simple answer to that, and because I simply don't know, just like most other people. And I think we can speculate about many of these other possibilities. China obviously invested huge amount of money and resources, national resources, into developing in these areas. Is it because that in the end, corporations, companies that are developing these chip technologies, or is it because these companies are are spending too much of their attention in the lower end or the middle end of the market because it's just too much money to be made? Is it because of corruption, which Xi Jinping would probably tell you that that is the reason, because he has arrested all these people that were involved in many of these companies and the investment of these companies? Is it because of that? Is it because of the dominance of some of these other companies, like including like Intel or maybe TSMC, on different levels of the supply chain, a different part of the supply chain, that they are simply dominant, and these Chinese companies cannot catch up? I think this is, I simply don't have the answer to that question, but it is something that I think Chun Yi, I know, has been trying to investigate into. Maybe she can help us more with that, with some insight into the answer to that question.
That's a very good segue. Thank you very much, Charles. So Chun Yi, I know this is one of your focus areas of research at the moment. So perhaps we can put this to you in a slightly different way. If we are facing economic decoupling in many economic areas of trade and business, which Jacob and Charles have started to describe, how do you think this is going to impact on supply chains? As I mentioned earlier, China by 2019 manufactured 27% of everything in the world. So we have these huge supply chains for a very wide range of goods that are manufactured in China, highly complex supply chains for global companies. How do you see that playing out in the next few years? Your thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Martin. And I think this is a great discussion forum that our TSP can work with you and to learn from both Jacob and Charles. Well, in my view, actually, the decoupling or the process of decoupling is a very sticky process. And it is actually also from China's side. They want to decouple us, both Jacob and Charles already mentioned. I just wanted to add that it's not just only for the intention China, we observed they wanted to decouple. They indeed have an initiative of Made in China 2025 that was learning from the German made 4.0 in a sense to achieve of the industrial upgrading. Made in China 2025 was initiated in 2015, was after Xi Jinping became president, and it has this kind of ambition and also intention to learn from the Western knowledge know-how, but then decouple from Western knowledge know-how, because China indeed felt that it is not reliable to work with the West, actually. So from my end, I can see it is not just the West wanted to decouple from China, but also the Chinese, they don't really love the West. It's just they learned the know-how from the West, and then they would dispose any waste of economy or investment in China. They wanted pretty much to formulate a self-sufficient system for themselves, in a sense, or with like-minded countries' economy in many, many ways. How does that impact on the supply chain? And it is actually in many ways that supply chain already started to decouple, already started to separate it from China, not just started from the trade war 2018, but also actually since China, well, from my observation, for instance, that since China had quite notorious labor standard in 2010, many companies started to say, well, we see what Apple's subcontractor Foxconn mistreated their workers. Could be possible Foxconn we could relocate our factories, low-end factories, to other countries. That is to, for instance, what Charles already mentioned, Vietnam, and also Eastern European countries, not in China, because the Chinese market would actually jeopardize our CSR performance with the big company brands. So that kind of a low-end decoupling already happened. Now, it is more actually interesting to see the high end, which is what we've discussed already a lot about the technology and also knowledge economy. How does China would be sort of emerge if it's not just the economic giant, but also technology giant, and that correspond to what Martin, you discussed with Charles before, why China could not be sort of like a technology innovator in to surpass most of the Western economy and to compete with the USA till now. In my observation, actually exactly like China knew, for instance, in the specific sector, semiconductor that I'm working, China has already started to invest a lot and has started to steal or invested to Western countries in order to learn the know-how, but they are not yet to manufacture the quality semiconductor products. So why is the case? That is, I would say that because of the so-called the central government's control to the markets, it is very rigid for any company actually to, especially the innovation company, to work and function in China. And it is with not just corruption, but also the central government's regulation and also paperwork and all that bureaucrats stuff that restrains a lot of the innovation manufacturers to develop in China. Their innovation relies on the biggest, well, a lot of the capital and also the trained, highly skilled engineers. Capital China has. We all know that Chinese government input a lot of money, but where does the money go? That's the question. And that is just not just only the corruption, but also local governments misfund and everything. That actually does not really help the very specific innovative sector, for instance, semiconductor, to develop in China. And that is actually Chinese semiconductor industry or innovation industry were actually also at the beginning started to be invested by the Taiwanese companies. And the Taiwanese companies, even though they set up, or for instance, the TCMC's, their retired workers, or they've been bored of hand-hunted to China, they couldn't really get used to the system and also really couldn't stay in like kind of the central directory. They couldn't really make the company to work. And in a sense that is many of the misfound and many of the mismanagements within this kind of so-called innovation setting. And it can be seen that although China has a lot of money, a lot of funds, but it doesn't really work. And that also requires a lot of the company, innovation companies, the commitment, personnel's commitment to the company, which again, for the short time that, well, for the time that I could visit Zhangjiang in Shanghai and also the high technology science park in Zhongguancun, I couldn't find that kind of really the commitment in a sense of they feel like they would innovate, they would have the freedom to do the jobs they would like to do. So in my view, that's the reason, well, one of the reasons, because there must be many, I couldn't really answer why China couldn't do the semiconductor. I would say the society or the sort of the restraint from the government actually killed the very point of innovation. And be aware that it's being the supply chain of the innovation like semiconductor, you are not just a subcontractor. You have to be flexible. You have to answer to your customers' requirements. This is why the TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, produced 56% of the chips for the world chip markets, because this kind of flexibility and this kind of committed to the production. That is the reason why Taiwan can be sort of the leader of the semiconductor in the global markets. Well, I wouldn't really know how what that would be really well played, because we our previous two speakers both mentioned, and indeed, this is what I've observed, that it is pretty much heading into the two set of operational mode, one led by the liberal economies, one led by the authoritarian countries, for instance, China, Russia. In my view, it is going to these trends, especially in the low-end supply chain. But I am not very sure whether that would work for the highly innovative technology economy, for the very reason that I don't really see China has so much money, but I couldn't really see in the past 5 to 10 years, China would have the breakthrough for the very reason innovation needs freedom, need liberal mindset. The Silicon Valley doesn't just come through that American government defense, Ministry of Defense, put a big money in Silicon Valley and then boom, it happened. No, there's a creative mindset that happened, gathered and attract people and talented people from the globe to work there. So now we back to what at the beginning Jacob said, and also we discussed about this dynamic COVID zero. If China already been rigid and then they close the door, I very doubt the supply chain, especially at a high and innovative one, that China can function and lead alongside with the Western liberal economies of our markets. And I should end here that we can discuss further. Yeah.
Well, Chun-Yi, I think you touched on a critical point at the end that doesn't just relate to semiconductors, but also to other areas of innovation. And whether that requires a vibrant civil society, part of which is highly successful and open universities that attract the best talent. And we know from the people we've hosted on this platform at Asia Scotland Institute in the past, there are some terrific academics in China at universities. We also know that some of them don't like to say certain things because they can't. And there's a lack of openness about what they can say in relation to some of their research. So clearly that is a key issue, and it leaves eventually a technological advantage with countries like the USA, Taiwan, I would hope the UK, but perhaps not so much, unfortunately, because of the nature of openness leading to innovation in society. So I wonder if I could put the next question, perhaps back to Jacob, but and relating to openness a little bit. So Jacob, we've had a question from Elizabeth Marshall about the relationship between Russia and China, and some reports she's read about Xi Jinping possibly not taking a call from Vladimir Putin. Who knows? I'm sure Xi Jinping's quite busy actually, but how do you see those relationships? So we now have Russia that's politically isolated, not quite economically isolated because it sells oil and gas at a very high premium on markets at the moment with the price levels. And also it clearly has continued trade links with China. How do you see those relationships developing in relation to decoupling? Is that an asset or a weakness to China, for example?
Yeah. I mean, as to the specific point about him, Xi Jinping maybe snubbing a call from Putin. I mean, I wouldn't really speculate on rumors too much, but from what I see, Xi Jinping is busy taking his new boys around to Yan'an for the apparently a bunch of the Central Committee has gone with him, and they're touring all the Yan'an rectification movement sites and stuff like that, which is a worrying message. But so maybe he was just too busy to call Putin back. But as to that developing relationship, I mean, it fits in, more broadly speaking, with the way that the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese outbound investment and construction projects more broadly fit into decoupling trends, which is that Beijing is very conscientiously moving to try to position itself so that if it must, it can sort of disconnect from the West. And in the meantime, it wants to connect with the rest of the world. So you look at oil and gas, for example, China imports a huge amount of its natural gas from Australia and the United States through LNG. Obviously, Russia is a great energy partner. So is Central Asia. You know, even these kind of almost North Korea-like countries like Turkmenistan. You know, rich in natural gas. There's a ton of Chinese investment from companies like the China National Petroleum Corporation going in there to secure those. And it's about diversifying its energy supplies. It's also about becoming less reliant on liberal market economies. So there is a, you know, I wouldn't say it's a Cold War 2.0. We have the NATO bloc and the Warsaw Pact bloc. I don't think it's quite like that. It's not such a military kind of aspect of these blocks. It's more economic blocks that are being built up. And you see, frankly, the same with the investment in a lot of the infrastructure in Pakistan or in Myanmar that run these pipelines down to the oceans that go all the way up to China. These are pretty clearly meant to be alternatives in case the Straits of Malacca have to be closed for whatever reason. These are not the kinds of decisions that are made to try to spur growth or to spur maximum return on investment. These are security-minded investments. And I think that's what was driving a lot of the shift from Beijing to move a bit closer to Moscow. I don't know what exactly happened with how much Xi Jinping actually knew when they met at the Olympics and declared their no limits partnership as to what Putin would or wouldn't do with Ukraine. But yeah, it's an important part of this complex transition. And you know, you can say the same thing about a lot of Chinese investment into the rest of the world being about trying to not replace, but to sort of replace, you know, the West as export markets for Chinese goods. Again, all these things have very clear strategic decision-making behind them. Yeah, that's frankly, I think, you know, maybe the G7 are just now starting to wake up to with their new investments thing, their new infrastructure projects, but that was also just a rebranding of something that they announced a year ago. So hopefully they take that competition a bit more seriously. But yeah.
That's terrific. Thanks, Shakespeare. Actually, I think we should all have a quick look at the People's Daily tomorrow, because I'm sure the front page picture will be 7 people in front of the caves at Yan'an. There's bound to be some very good, and as you said, a very clear message about certain policy directions from the new Politburo and the reaffirmed president. Well picked up, if I may. Thank you very much. Charles, could we go back to technology? I don't want to dwell on chips too much because we're getting a bit hung up on it, but you touched on the US Chips Act before, and Fraser Shaw has asked about silicon security. As Fraser has said, the US spending 130 billion, the EU spending 50 billion. I'm not quite sure of the specific reference to that. Although silicon may be made in Taiwan, the actual packaging is still being done in China. So Fraser's asked what the UK is doing. I think we can't quite answer that today, Fraser, but how do you see the technology security issues in terms of importance in relation to decoupling?
Okay, by the question, I think Fraser may be really talking about security in the sense of that particular economy or country or block of country being able to do things on their own without depending too much on others. I presume that is what he meant by silicon security. And I think it's important to understand that it is very difficult, even for the United States today, to do it all alone. I think a lot of people look at the CHIPS Act and think that, and they focus on the fact that the government is providing subsidies to companies like Intel or others, or even foreign companies, actually, Samsung or TSMC, to build plants in the US. I think that's only part of it. They want to make sure that they are not going to be way behind in terms of the capacity and the technology in doing fabrication and manufacturing. But I think the US better understand that in this day and age, and as the last 20, 30 years have proven, no country will be able to do it all on their own. And I think that is probably one thing that China thinks rather differently for the time being still. And so I don't believe that that's actually what the US is doing. And I think by the fact that they are trying to use the CHIP Act they talk about the Silicon Four or something like that, the countries that they are working with, like Korea, like Japan and Taiwan, to make sure that they are on the US camp. Despite that, that might mean many of these companies have to, or many of the companies from those other countries have to give up some of the uh, market in China, some of the investment that they have been putting into China in terms of building plants and so on in the past several years. They probably have to slow that down or even stop doing that. That is a big decision for many of these countries to be making. And I think it is actually the same that is happening in Europe and maybe UK companies, even though I'm not very familiar with most of the UK semiconductor companies, but I imagine that they are facing the same dilemma. And I've been talking to people from some of these other Asian countries, and I think the common worry that they have about the United States is whether or not they are trying to do the same thing as what is perceived to be what the Chinese are doing, had been doing, which is to invite you to come in and learn everything you have, entice you with my big market, and then they'll kick you out. And then they will want to have a domestic supply chain that would be able to do everything without you. And I think that is their worry. And so I believe actually the United States have to work with their partners, the European partners and the Asian partners like Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, to make sure that they are providing these companies from these countries with a win-win situation. And they have to assure that this is a new supply chain, maybe minus China, but still win-win for everybody else. Otherwise, I'm seeing a lot of pushback from many of the companies from these countries, particularly in Korea and Japan and Europe, actually, saying that, hey, what's in it for me? Because are you going to take over everything that we do? And at the same time, we're losing this big, huge China market.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Yeah.
It's it is challenging for companies that that invest in China, and there's an old saying that in China, for investing and looking at their market, you have to lose a little bit of money in the short term in order to lose a lot of in the long term. Many companies have found that with their strategies. It's quite challenging. Chun-Yi, we have a few minutes left before I hand over to Roddy, our chairman, for closing. Perhaps you can just give us some perspective from Taiwan. I know you're in the UK, but you're from Taiwan. And I think we often look to people in Taiwan to better understand China in its history, because you have very, very good insight into being a close neighbor, or you are the Republic of China as part of your de facto title. So how does Taiwan fit into US-China decoupling or East-West decoupling? And obviously that's with the perspective that there's a significant amount of Taiwanese investment in mainland China, with industrialists, manufacturing plants, assembly plants, etc. It's a very tricky path that Taiwanese investors and industrialists have taken in the past 50 years, and a very smart path, perhaps. How do you see that perspective from Taiwan?
Well, I don't, thank you, Martin, but I think that to understand China, probably Taiwan, the window of Taiwan is also getting short, because Taiwan and China is almost frozen since Tsai Ing-wen came to the president in 2016. But however, to answer the question that Taiwan actually is at the hotspot of this geo-complicated technology warfare, for the reason that Taiwan is the leading semiconductor manufacturer. As I mentioned earlier, 56% TSMC is manufacturing to the world, and Taiwan, China is getting hotter than ever after August Speaker Pelosi's visit, and then almost like every, I wouldn't say week, but definitely many of the important MPs from congressmen from the US, and also potentially also from the UK, would visit Taiwan. and that pushed Taiwan off to the spots that China is very, I should say, angry about, and also to consolidate, if she wants to consolidate his ambition, that Taiwan is the place that to reunify with the motherland. How Taiwan to do, and especially there are so much Taiwanese investments in China, how Taiwan sustain itself. So 2 points. From Taiwan's perspective, Taiwan already trying hard to relocate the investments from China to Southeast Asia. Started in 1996, Li Denghui, the former president's Go South policy, and then the Tsai Ing-wen's new southbound policy. The gradual transfer from China to Southeast Asia has started, but not quite, I would say, because Southeast Asia markets or labor market is not as convenient as to the Taiwanese manufacturers. But a second point would be Taiwan now is really getting to the understanding that China is not the place that they would negotiate, discuss, or work with, especially after what happened in Hong Kong. So it is a lot of the self-awareness. If Taiwan is not the most self-aware country in the world to understand how dangerous China is, then Taiwan it's already become much more of the closed, decoupled a lot from the Chinese markets, and Taiwan is very much wanted to be aligned with the Silicon Alliance. That is what we discussed all along about the technology alliance, and with the US and also Asia economies, Asia countries, Japan and South Korea. And the last point I wanted to say, to make sure this liberal, like-minded alliance work, is to know that actually China is possible to be omitted, because as I go back to my previous points, China, although it's a big market and big labor source, but to the technology economy, China's technology is not yet actually to produce the quality technology product. They can assemble, they can package, but not yet to the quality supply chain. So it is possible actually to decouple from China from that point. And Taiwan is playing the key role in that sense to produce the quality chips, quality technology products, and well, it's an open society and liberal minded. So I ended on this point.
But thank you very much, Tunyi. I think I should sort of end on a hopeful note and hope that there is not further decoupling and there is not further deglobalization, and that the trading, economic and political links between China and the US and the rest of the world can improve. Doesn't look very hopeful, I'm sorry to say, in the next several years for various reasons that I think we can go on to on the next webinar discussion. But Roddy, our chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, Roddy, could I just hand over to you for closing? And if I may thank Chunyi, Jacob and Gunther, really a pleasure to see you and hear you and discuss with you. But Roddy, if I may hand over to you for closing.
Martin, thank you very much indeed for having made this panel discussion possible. It's hugely timely, and who knows what the future will deliver for China and its relationships. I think that Xi's position may change, it may be eroded over time. And the area that we've been talking about is one where countries and markets do need to work together. I don't believe in deglobalization. I think that we live in an interconnected world, and that will become more and more obvious going forward. But I'd like to thank everybody, not only for listening to the panel, which is extremely interesting, and these proceedings have been recorded and will be posted on YouTube, so you'll be able to hear more in the future, but also for the extremely perceptive comments from our panelists. So to all of you, on behalf of the Asia Scotland Institute, thank you very much.